So, what happens next? What goes on? So, I have a number of things that I want to continue working on. One of the pleasures of being I can't imagine saying this, a senior anthropologist who is a pioneer is that people think that I know things, and so they invite me to come and comment and give kind of overviews of developments. And so it's been really, really interesting reading recent work on the anthropology of Christianity in particular, and having a chance to weigh in and make some comments on that work, and to try to put together, to go beyond the case studies and put together larger pictures of things. And so I've done that with an article on politics of Christianity in Papua New Guinea, where very little research has been done on politics and Christianity, although it's every election campaign they run there, Jesus runs as the running mate of most candidates. So it's very, very visible, like Christianity is in general on PNG. So I think that's going to be an important area for future research. And it's, again, I'm doing less and less of the initial research, but it's been a great privilege and pleasure to be kind of in a position where I can look over what people are doing and try to see patterns and things of that. So it's something I want to do a bit more of as I go forward. The other thing that's been a great pleasure to do is, at this stage in my career, has been to get more in the business of editing other people's work, and particularly of soliciting manuscripts and so forth. So I'm now the academic editor of two series at the University of Toronto Press. One of them is a series that published my book, and so we're looking to encourage, as I was saying earlier, anthropologists to write books that are accessible and interesting to non-anthropologists, undergraduate students. And we also have a new series going of short books on particular subjects called Anthropological Insights. So we've published one now on global inequality. We have another one coming out on mental illness. We are getting one on global warming, and just a whole variety of topics. And so it's just it's fantastic for me to see how people develop these things and how they squeeze these topics into 100 pages or so, because that's what we're looking for. So that's been fun. And then with my own work, like most anthropologists, I've accumulated a huge amount of field notes and field work and so forth. And I was mentioning earlier that I have all these sermons that are sitting there on a shelf somewhere and so forth. And so I'm at the stage where I'm wondering what to do with that and what I should do with that. And so part of what I've been doing is been thinking about archives. And I had there's a great Melanesian studies archives down in San Diego, and the archivist from there is a friend who stayed with us, for my wife and I, for about a week, and went through our stuff together. And we talked about how to handle the ethics of it and accessibility, because our notes include things about individuals that might be embarrassing for them, and this raises questions about what you release. And our work includes notes that may not be all that accurate, because people tell you all sorts of things, you write it all down, you're not judging it. And those inaccuracies may be important in terms of things like land claims and family feuds and things of that nature. So there's a real question here that I've been struggling with, and I think people in my generation are now. It's just what you make available, how you make it available, and so forth. And the historian part of me struggles with the anthropological part of me, because as a historian, I love the letters, I love the personal stuff. And as an anthropologist, I would be appalled if anybody saw mine. So this is something I want to think more about and work more about with the people who are working in the archives, about how you handle these materials and so forth. And archivists have been thinking about this for a long time. I don't think anthropologists have been thinking about it nearly enough. So that's one area I want to go into. I'd love to get back into the Anglican archives in Port Moresby, and I'd like to expand looking at those logbooks that I mentioned before, so I can look at the early development of Christianity across a wider area in Papua New Guinea, And I don't know if that will happen. Port Moresby is one of the most dangerous cities in the world. It's also one of the most expensive cities in the world to be in, mostly because PNG makes most of its money now from large extractive industries, gold mining and copper mining in particular, and their executives pay very high money to be in those hotels that are there. So it's become very difficult and expensive to work in the cities. And the countryside is fine, but the archives are in the cities. So we'll just have to see, but that's one of my dreams, to do that. And then the other project that I'm really keen on, and I don't know if it's going to happen, but I'd like to stop writing as an anthropologist, and I'd like to start writing as I joke, as a human being. Not as an academic, but I've always enjoyed popular histories in particular, people like Erik Larson and so forth. And I would like to do something like that when I grow up. So I have this idea, and this is kind of an idea that comes out. I should preface this by saying that a lot of anthropologists have issues with Jared Diamond, particularly Melanesianists, because Diamond worked as a bird watcher primarily in New Guinea for many years, and has used his experiences in New Guinea to write about his views about non-Western tribal peoples. And we find much of it kind of simplistic, and sometimes we find much of it worse than simplistic. But one of the problems that many of us have with it is this notion that Papua New Guineans represent, quote unquote, our past, that we can look at people in a place like New Guinea and see how our ancestors used to live. And this is an idea that is so much in the literature, including the anthropological literature, is almost cultural, buried common sense. And so it comes through the metaphors, it comes through the way people talk about the past and the present. Even the word traditional has this sort of sense of stasis and so forth. So I've been asking myself, how would you present knowledge about and from Papua New Guinea in a way that doesn't do that? In a way that it says, well, you know, Papua New Guinea has actually changed the way the world is, rather than the world has changed while Papua New Guinea has stayed the same. So I've been thinking about that quite a lot, and it's along the lines of models of books like How the Scots Changed the World and things like that. And I thought it actually kind of makes some sense, because at really critical moments, knowledge from New Guinea on issues like economics, Anna Malinowski's work, or gender, Margaret Mead's work, transsexuality, Gilbert Hurt's work and others, have really challenged the kind of common sense thinking that people have on these kinds of topics. And we tend to think of it, well, we go to a tribal society and they show us that there's another variation in human culture. This is the Margaret Mead natural experiment model. But another way of saying it is that these people are teaching us something, and that something makes a difference. And so I think my long-term goal is, and I may do this in retirement, is to write a popular book on how Melanesians have changed the world. So they're not seen, using language where the people are not seen as being the last home of Stone Age man, a place you go to find out how the ancestors lived, the place you go to blow up theories because you show there's at least one last hidden tribal group that doesn't do it that way, but instead a place which actually has contributed to world knowledge and to intellectual history in its own right, and should be spoken about that way, and can be spoken about that way, the way we talk about Europeans or Asian civilizations. I think that would be a challenge, and I think that would be very worthwhile doing. So that's what I would like to do next. The other thing I would like to do next is, again, using this sort of position of privilege as an academic, to explore some new worlds as well. So that's a kind of new world. It's a new intellectual world. But we also get opportunities. So my wife, Anne, is going to be training mental health workers next summer in Bhutan for 3 months. I've never been to Bhutan, so I'm looking forward to learning something about Bhutan and hopefully contributing something to the study of maybe traditional medicine there and comparing it to what I've learned here in British Columbia and what I've learned in Papua New Guinea. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about being filmed and being in films. As I've mentioned this in passing, and it's actually been an important and interesting part of my career and part of my learning about things. And I wanted to mention it as well because so many of our students now want to make documentaries. So many of them want to do more documentaries than write documents. And so at the risk of sounding like an old fogey, I want to make an argument in favor of documents. Not that I have anything against videos in particular. When I went to New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, the first time in 1981, and was living in the village in Uyaku. My wife Anne went back to Canada after about 9 months there, and I was there not on my own. There were 500 other people there, but I was there without Anne for about 6-7 months while she was working back here in Canada. And during that period, I met some people. I'll give the short version of the story. At the airstrip who wanted a place to stay, came down and stayed at Uyaku and so forth. And they told me that they had an American friend who was going to make a film which was going to be an expose of all the bad things anthropologists do in the world. And this was right at the height of the kind of critique of anthropologists as cultural appropriation and things like that, which I already felt pretty guilty about. So anyways, they told me about this, but it was kind of in a friendly way, and I didn't think about it. And then a few months later, a white woman appeared in a dinghy on the beach. She came in, people brought her to my house, but she wouldn't talk to me. She wanted to talk to a particular person. That particular person was up the coast in another place, so she went off to visit with that person, and that person wouldn't talk to her. I wouldn't talk to her. So eventually, she came back and she told me that she was going to make this film, and that these people in Port Moresby had told her that I was kind of a Kurtz-like figure from the heart of darkness who was living in extravagance in the Mysing village and exploiting them and things like that. And she had been there for a couple of days and hadn't seen any sign of this, so this was a bit of a relief. Then she met with the elders in the community, and they were all keen to have a film made and put on American television, of course, because they thought this would be good publicity for them and they would get money from it. And so she came through, and they made a film called Anthropology on Trial, which was made for PBS. And it was a really learning experience to me because I'd seen ethnographic films before, and this was with a film crew that came through in 3 days and didn't interact very much with the local people. We really didn't have time to because they were shooting a real film, so they couldn't see what they were shooting. And they were shooting to put together a story. And so they put together that story, and that was shown on PBS right around the time I was doing my dissertation defense. I was in, I thought this could destroy my career, frankly, because, of course, I could be portrayed any way they wanted. As it turned out, they decided that Margaret Mead was the evil one, and I'm put up as the foil that's doing the right stuff. But ironically, they criticized Margaret Mead for bringing in modern stuff and for not paying attention to what the people were interested in. I'm presented in this film as somebody who's interested in traditional rituals and history and so forth. They didn't mention anywhere there that I was studying Christianity. So they misrepresented what I was doing to make me look more positive, as it turned out. So from that, I started learning just, how much films can really skew our understanding of things, and that documents, of course, also skew our understanding of things, but they provide a lot more detail, and they provide a lot more entry point for critique and getting into the complexity of things, which I think is really important. So that was my first film experience. I was later at a AAA session with Napoleon Chagnon, who had done a series of films in which he was filmed, in which he got into a screaming match with the audience. And so that never became a book, but it was quite the experience to be beside him and watch him do a kind of his version of a Yanomami axe fight. But I never knew quite how to write about this or think about this. And then when the Mycene were fighting off the loggers, I thought that it was important for them to get world publicity for this, even more than they were getting. And I also thought it would be good to have a real ethnographic film made of their experience as they're experiencing it, and an honest film. So they're not being presented as primitive, pristine people who love the environment or whatever, but as people with actually a lot of experience and very complex and mixed feelings about what's going on. And so I started to work with a filmmaker here in Canada, who shall go unnamed for the moment. We had a couple of one trip to the village in '98 with her and the filmmaker, the director that she wanted to work with. It involved many, many meetings in different villages because everything there operates by consensus. And it involved very, very, very detailed and close negotiations because the villages are very competitive with each other. And Uyaku is the largest village, was getting most of the workshops, most of the visitors, things like that. And the other villages were very resentful. And those villages were more likely to sign a contract with the logging companies. So the leaders were very, very conscious of the need to share the experience out. And so we had an agreement to do that, and it was all worked out. We got into fundraising, and we switched this as well to the idea of an exchange of First Nations from here in Canada going to visit the Mycene and a return trip of the Mycene to the First Nations. So in the end, 5 members of the Stalo First Nation came to Uyaku in 2000 with me, along with the film crew, and it was a disaster. And it was a disaster for the Mycene, not so much a disaster for the film, but it was a disaster because the filmmakers had a notion of the quality of the film they wanted to make, so they were shooting it in real film. This is a time when video would have been fine. And so they ended up shooting the same scenes over and over and over again. So the Stalo got frustrated because they didn't have much time to talk to the Mycene. And the Mycene were kind of puzzled by why these people were here. And some of the most interesting exchanges that were taking place most of them never got filmed because the filmmakers really weren't conscious of them or aware of them or interested in them. So Mycene would come to me at night and they say stuff like, the Stalo are telling us about residential schools where their kids were they're made to speak English and so forth. And they're saying they're really bad. But we want our kids to go to a residential school to learn English so they can get a job. And this is not an argument in favor of residential schools, God forbid, but it's a difference. And some of the Stalo would say, we were oppressed by the missionaries, and Mycene would go say, we're good Christians. And so you have this kind of thing going on. Mycene didn't think of themselves as indigenous people. That's not a term that made sense for them then. It does now. And so there were these interesting bits of dialogue going on that never got into the film. In the same time, too, I had to fight like mad to get the film crew to go to more than one village. So there were all sorts of political rumblings that were coming out of this as well. So for me, it was a very frustrating and difficult experience, and a little reluctant to talk about it because the filmmakers are here. Here in Canada, the film was broadcast in the nature of things. It presents the Mycene as a pristine traditional people who are fighting to retain their culture as warriors against the outside world. I think it's a very flattering film in a mythical sense. I find it a very insulting film to this day. I can't watch it to the people. It was followed up with a film of a group of Mycene visiting Stalo here that I wasn't invited to be involved with that at this point. We had broken it off. And it shows Mycene, I think, also in a way that's not respectful. They're shown as being kind of lost, gaping at a shopping mall, things of that nature. So it makes me very sad that that happen. But I think I also kind of learned a lesson from this, that long-term field work, slow research, is really, really important, not just for anthropologists, but especially for anthropological filmmakers, because you have those images, and those images are so open to manipulation by the voiceover or by the caption or just by their placement. This film, the first film they made, for instance, shows a road going through the forest, and this voiceover makes it sound like that road is nearing the village. That road is actually 1,000 kilometers away in a different part of the country. And, you know, I know why he did it, and maybe that road will be there someday, but it's a lie. That's not what's happening. So I think long-term field work makes you more honest, and it makes you also think about your own work and your earlier work, and whether that, the quality of that work and what you've learned since too, and the ability to critique it as well. So I wrote about this in a fairly obscure place, a collection on long-term field work. It's something I'd like to maybe do more with as well, but mainly I want to make an argument that slow writing, slow thinking has real value based upon slow long-term research. It just reminds you of how complex things are, and I think it reminds you too, or at least gives you the space to think about your own responsibilities, both with the people you're working with and for the future, because these are records that other people are going to be consulting.